My dad was born in Montenegro in 1952. Most of the country was composed of farmers, and our family was no different. My father had started doing farm work when he was very young, probably around the age of 5 or 6. Back then, families utilised all capable hands, and if you were old enough to walk, you were old enough to work. His duties would usually include watching sheep, collecting hay, and sometimes feeding the animals. He is the oldest of 3 brothers, so when he reached the ripe age of 10, in the farming world 10 is an adult, he was ready to be sent to Sinjavina for training. Now Sinjavina, let's call it Sion from now on, this name is too fucking hard to pronounce even for me, is a mountain in Montenegro where my family owned a watermill. How and why they built the mill that high up, I don't know. I suppose the river was powerful there, and producing flour meant food for a year. This is why my grandfather decided to train my dad at a young age. When April of '62 came around, my dad and his uncle Mike hit the road with their dog Max and headed towards the mountain Sion. The trouble with owning watermills in a place as remote as that is that there's no maintenance for nearly a full year. This means the mill will get damaged by heavy snow, winds, and even animals that are searching for shelter. The trip up the mountain was no easy task. It took about 3 hours of climbing the steep dirt road to make it to the river where the watermill was. When they finally arrived at the mill, they were unpleasantly surprised. The place was damaged pretty bad. The ceiling was partially collapsed, and the left wall was broken down. "Not again," sighed Miki as he stepped inside. My dad had no idea what that meant. The mill itself was very small. It was basically a room built out of wood, connected with a flour storage room in the back. My dad and his uncle still needed shelter from the cold mountain night, so they got to work. Miki estimated that it would take them at least a few days to completely fix the building. The first night my dad fell asleep almost instantly. A long walk combined with that sharp mountain air could put anyone to sleep. Sometimes in the middle of the night, my father was awoken by Max's silent barking. It almost sounded like the dog was actually crying, something my dad had never heard him do. Miki slept peacefully, but my dad got up to look around. At first, he couldn't find anything that would cause Max to bark. But then a huge rat jumped in front of him. It scared the shit out of my dad, but he laughed it off and petted Max to settle him down, then decided to go back to sleep. As he was laying down in his sleeping bag, there were no beds up there, he looked through the collapsed wall and froze almost instantly. In a grass field some 100 yards away stood a man. He appeared to be wearing all white clothes, which, combined with the moonlight, made him nearly glow in the dark of the night. The man just stood there and looked straight at the cabin. As my dad started shaking Miki to wake him up, the man in white started walking away, disappearing into the nearby forest before Miki woke up. "Go back to sleep, kid," said Miki as he rolled over. My father figured it was just a hallucination of his mind and that he was just half asleep. So he lay his head down and drifted off once more. The next day Miki and Dad spent building the cabin and running the mill. Everything was great. As the night started settling in, both my father and his uncle began to get tired. Mieke decided to call it a day. They sat outside the half-finished house and Mieke made some basic food, cheese and bread and a glass of milk, or something like that. As they got inside the mill, they noticed that Max wouldn't go in. No matter how much they called, the dog just stood outside the building, weeping silently. They had no idea what was going on, but they were too tired to figure it out. As they lay down, my dad noticed that his sleeping bag had something in it. He lit a candle and realised that his bag was full of flour. "What the hell?" he asked as he got up and started shaking his sleeping bag. Then the candlelight shone on the floor. On it, written in flour, was one word: Inaace, which translates to "go away." "Uncle Mieke, what's this?" my father asked as he pointed the candle to the message written in flour. Mieke walked over and stopped as soon as he saw it. "Jesus, I haven't seen this since I was a child," he said with a pale expression on his face. "Saw what? This message?" my dad asked. "We have to leave first thing in the morning," was all Mieke would say. "Be ready as soon as the sun comes up." "What's happening?" my father tried, but all Mieke said in response was, "Go to sleep." When Dad fell asleep, Max was still outside weeping. My father was awoken by Mieke's rough voice. "Let's go, kid. Time to leave," he said as he packed his sleeping bag. "Can you tell me why?" Dad asked, immediately realising that there would be no response. "Hold on, where's Max?" Mieke looked around worried. Max was nowhere to be found, even after their persistent calling. "We can't leave without him," Dad said, and surprisingly, Mieke seemed to agree. He loved that dog. They kept searching. Then my dad heard a loud, painful cursing. He ran towards it only to find Mieke sitting by the edge of the river. He was holding Max. My dad had never seen anything so gruesome before that day, so it was shocking to him when he saw a dog with its internal organs spilling out of its body. He had a huge cut on his stomach. "My God, what happened?" asked my father through the tears he couldn't quite hold back. "He must have fell into the water and the current slammed him up against those rocks," said Mieke, looking devastated. "We need to bury him." "What about going home?" my dad asked, still with tears running down his cheeks. "Max deserves a proper burial. We'll go home tomorrow." They spent a very quiet hour digging a grave for the beloved and unfortunate dog. Max was a golden lab and was the best dog in the world, according to my father. They spent the rest of the day in silence, fixing the mill. The night started settling in. When they got back into the cabin, the little remaining light revealed a terrifying thing. Another message on the floor. This time, also written in flour, were 3 letters, which said, "Now." Mieke seemed scared, more scared than my dad's ever seen him before. He didn't say anything, though he just wiped the damn flour with his foot. "We leave the first thing in the morning. This time I mean it," said Mieke as he wrapped himself into the bag. My dad wasn't going to argue. But he couldn't fall asleep. He tossed and turned, and finally just decided to look up and take in his surroundings, trying to find something to do. Then he saw the white man in the field again. He was just standing there, motionless, looking at the mill. He was staring straight at my dad. My father tried his best to squeeze his eyes and make out more details about this strange, almost glowing man in the dark. What he saw left him unable to speak. Next to the man stood Max. Stood. "Uncle Mickey," screamed my father. "Uncle Mickey, wake up!" Mickey jumped up immediately. "What the fuck is happening?" he yelled, still disorientated. "Look, the man in the field, and Max." Mickey lost all colour in his face instantly. "God," was all Mickey managed to say. "Who is that? And Max, is he okay?" Dad begged. No, he's not okay," his uncle said. "Max is gone." "But he's right there." "Max is gone, you hear me? Now try to get some sleep. I will stay up and guard the place until the sun comes up." "I'm scared." "Me too, kid. Me too," Mickey answered silently. "But we'll be okay." Naturally, it was nearly impossible for my father to fall further asleep. But the night got the best of him and he dozed off at some point. He was awoken by the power of the sun coming through the still, not fixed, wall of the mill. "Uncle Mickey?" he asked as he got up. No response. He called Mickey's name many more times, all with the same result. He looked around the mill and the field, but he couldn't find anyone. Simply put, he was terrified. Imagine you're a 10-year-old kid on a mountain with virtually nobody around and a strange man in white appearing at night with what seemed like your dead dog. And now, your only guardian, the only adult, is gone. My father did what every kid would do in that situation. He started crying. He cried and cried. He was too scared to do anything else. He contemplated trying to get back home, but that trip was too long for a little kid to go by himself. He decided to stay in the mill and wait for Mickey to show up. He had to. As the night started settling in, the fear in the helpless kid grew wilder. Every noise he'd hear, even if it was only a branch moving in the wind, caused him to nearly break down. He decided not to light any candles so that he wouldn't draw attention to himself. And there my father sat, at the edge of the collapsed wall inside the mill. He sat and looked out into the field, expecting the man in white to show up at any moment. The more he waited, the more scared he became. The worst part was that the night was incredibly silent. Not even trees moving in the wind could be heard. About an hour before the sunrise, the fear in my dad reached the point of no return, and he decided that he had to light a candle, even if it meant he'd draw the white man's attention. He probably knew where he was anyways. Candlelight gave him a strange shot of confidence. Even if it was just for a short second, my father felt a little safer. Then he heard a wolf growl in the distance. The growl was so loud and so unexpected that my dad dropped the candle. Strangely, the light didn't go out. As he picked it up, he noticed a flower pattern on the floor. Only it wasn't writing. He tried his best to make out what it was. It was only when he brought the candle up to an inch away from the floor did he realise what it was. It was a paw print and flower. Now, our brain works intriguingly fast when faced with life-threatening danger. Although physically nearly paralysed in fear, my father's mind started racing. And then he realised. Paw print and flower. The man in white. He wasn't dressed in white. He was covered in flower. He was in the flower room. As if it were a bad horror movie, as my dad realised what was happening, the door of the flower room started creaking open. While his mind was running at 100 miles an hour, his legs wouldn't move. He just stood there, waiting for the man to show himself. What he saw instead was far worse. In front of him stood Max. Only it wasn't really Max. It was a carcass of his once beloved dog. A large part of his belly was missing, and his internal organs were clearly visible. The dog was breathing very loud, very heavy. He was covered in white, as if he'd been rolling in the flour. My dad stared at the dead dog for a few seconds, unable to move so much as a step. Then, the man in white walked from behind Max. My dad didn't take the time to study him as much as his dog. His legs regained energy and he just started sprinting. As he got out of the mill, he tripped on the broken board at the porch. He tripped right at his feet. At his uncle's feet. My dad looked up and saw a man that was once his family, his mentor. He was now neither of those. Mickey was white from the flour. But that wasn't the scariest thing about him. He was missing the bottom of his jaw. There are many things that will terrify and scar a 10-year-old, but seeing your uncle's tongue move freely without the bottom jaw is probably the scariest. My dad let out a short scream and fell backwards, fueled by impossible fear. He sprang up and started running away. He looked back to see that the man and Max were now running after him. Mickey was standing still in the back, still wiggling his long tongue around. My dad said he had never ran that fast again in his life. He could feel them at the back of his neck at all times. He turned around only once to see Max's intestines fall out as he was sprinting after his once beloved owner. The man appeared to run gracefully behind him. He even seemed to be smiling, and running looked effortless to him, almost like he was just having fun. My dad didn't stop running for at least an hour. The footsteps behind had died out more than 30 minutes previously, but he wasn't stopping, and he sure as hell wasn't turning around to see what was behind. He finally made it to the first house on the road, banged on the door, then collapsed when the owner finally appeared. My father woke up nearly a full day later, still exhausted. The people had no idea who he was, so they couldn't contact his family. Dad told them about everything that had happened, and they seemed not surprised. "We have to go back and get my uncle," my dad told them. "Son, I'm afraid that's impossible," the man who saved my dad said. "That man you saw, he's been living up there for generations now. We heard stories about him as kids, and that was 60 years ago." "But how is that possible? Who is he?" "Nobody knows," the man said. "But whoever gets picked up by him is never seen again. A lot of people claim to have seen him up in those fields at night. Some say he was an old mill worker who died there a long time ago, but I don't believe that. You're the first to let go." "And what about Uncle Mickey?" "I'm afraid it's too late for him," the man said. "Now let's get you home."